Welcome to Press Review with me, Ian Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm joined by my colleagues Maggie Pagano and Alistair Benn. Press Review is the show on Reaction where we pick the stories that have grabbed our attention in the last few days and weeks, with a bit of a global focus, actually. Now, my apologies for having been away with this thing called COVID, so you're going to have to bear with me a bit if I've still got a bit of COVID brain fog, but my two esteemed colleagues, I'm sure, will have lots and lots of good insights. Let's go first to you, Alistair. Your first pick is from the Daily Mirror.
So it's the story this week that's been sort of steadily gaining traction is the allegation that Number 10 had a shindig last year on the 18th of December. I think. I hope I've got that right, which was the day before London entered Tier 4 restrictions on the 19th, but we were at that point in Tier 3. I probably should explain what tiers were to some viewers. They were an exciting series of local restrictions which went up and down over October. And a lot of the country was actually in Tier 3 for most of that period, which was effectively lockdown. So we did have effectively a lockdown light throughout most of the last winter period. London was mostly in Tier 2 because rates were sort of comparatively quite low. Went into lockdown, then we went into a Tier 2 for sort of a week and a half, during which I went to a concert with loads of people and out for dinner and basically a nights out. It was a completely bizarre 2 weeks. And then we went to Tier 3 and Tier 4. And everything got very, very serious very fast in that period with the emergence of the Alpha variant. And it really felt like action stations. I cancelled all my travel plans at enormous personal cost, even though I arranged them 3 weeks earlier when the Prime Minister had assured us that it would be possible and that we'd be able to manage.
And millions of people, Alistair, had similar experiences, didn't they, in terms of altering party plans and Christmas plans with family.
Exactly. But apparently, and this is the story, Number 10 throughout the kind of this crucial period, in my view, in which, I think everyone realized how difficult the winter would be and how serious the situation was, apparently organized that there was a sort of Christmas get together on the 18th where it's alleged several dozens or 30 or 40, it's unclear precisely what the numbers were. People gathered, there were games, sort of Christmas games, there were, I assume there was alcohol. And I don't want to be a sort of Puritan about it, but these kinds of stories, I think do actually really annoy me. But I think in general, no one, not many people care. There's a sort of cynicism that set in. Well, everyone sort of assumes politicians are doing this sort of thing post Hancock and various people breaking it, and people I don't think really mind because they've also bent the rules in all kinds of ways in a creative way when it suited them, which is, I think, is totally reasonable and is something that we've all had to do from time to time to maintain a degree of sanity, and we've all had to appreciate what risks we were taking in doing that. I think the problem is those that I don't really have sympathy for the people in. It was this precise period, which was very, very serious and very, very worrying. And I remember it being very intense. And I didn't see anyone for long periods of the festive period. I didn't see any relatives. It was pretty dark and dreary. And I think that was the experience was shared, but clearly not by everyone.
But Maggie, it was a really good scoop for the Mirror, and the Mirror have made the running on it this week, haven't they? A series of splashes, and it's built. I have to admit that maybe I was slightly off the ball when the story started. I didn't think it would really take off, but they've hammered it day after day, and it does seem to have resonated with people. How do you feel about it?
Oh, I sort of, shrugged my shoulders on my head and thought, well, of course they did. It doesn't surprise me one bit. And I think Alistair hit it on nail on the head, is that sort of that's what we expect, actually. We have such a low opinion of our politicians. But I do think that period was very tense. I remember, deciding, do we meet grandchildren, children for Christmas? Do we sit outside? All those sort of silly, now seem ridiculous decisions. But it was quite distraught, tense time. And so I spoke, and we knew everybody was going through this. And it was what we tried to decide, our own risk, our own personal risk. So actually it was a personal choice. So, and one hoped that it was part of a social contract. Even if we didn't agree with it, even we thought it was over the top, we did it because we were all doing it together. So that's what the disappointment is. But if they really were 30, 40 together, weren't they all sort of quite nervous about getting the virus? And maybe they have, politicians usually are high risk alpha male and women, aren't they? So I don't know. But
yeah, I mean, I must admit, when the story landed on social media, there was a really interesting argument or debate about it. I underestimated, I think, how angry people were about it. It seemed to me another example of, just, you compare this to the Second World War, where people were not drunk all the time, but in positions of authority, life kind of carried on, and there were various parties, and they ate and drank very well. Though that doesn't seem to, the people seem to be rather offended by having Boris Johnson compared to his hero Winston Churchill.
Can I just point something out?
Situations are obviously not the same.
Yeah, to that argument, Ian, what they didn't do during the war, Churchill didn't stand up and say, you're going to kill your granny if you go and have Christmas with her. It was very, very different mood. And that's the difference. We were told, asked, scared into taking behavioral to do things that we didn't really want to do. And most people did. I think that's where they went wrong.
Yeah.
So there's a big difference, if I may say so.
So I'm going to go with my choice next, which is related to all of this by someone who was, of course, at the heart of Downing Street in that period, or rather before it. And going to talk about Dominic Cummings' latest Substack newsletter, which the link is below if you want to subscribe to it. I do. It's always interesting. Don't necessarily always agree with it, but it has an interesting take. And he's got his latest thoughts on COVID this week. Actually, just came out on Friday evening, which he says a few thoughts on COVID. As he says, I hope you're all taking vitamin D. As per previous advice, if not, then start. He takes a really pretty tough view on this, thinks that it's going to be worse on Omicron than governments are admitting to. And he also makes has a critique of the attitude of Boris Johnson and ministers, that essentially he says, well, look, the vaccine task force existed because he and Vote Leave and various others and Valence pushed it, but that he feels a lot of that momentum has collapsed in the year or so since. Quite a funny passage where he says, rather than building on that success, instead the PM has decided to try to rewrite history and then he sent Hancock out to do this across the media, claiming there was no herd immunity plan. B, allowed Westminster entropy to degrade the task force and fail to even to order enough antivirals. So hence the quiet panic underway this week. The picture he paints is of a Whitehall, which, this is where I have a criticism, is that it's ultimately self-serving. I mean, his view would be that it's that he, of course, is advocating public interest, but he's presenting a picture of reorganization under him and his small group of Vote Leave friends, which has then been squandered by Boris Johnson. But I think that psychologically, I think he's unaware of the impact which he and his friends had, Maggie, on the way in which they were behaving and the way in which they alienated a lot of officials. And it's not really a surprise, is it, that post Cummings, the Mandarin class has dismantled some of what he advocated and has gone back to, as they would see it, a calmer, more sensible approach. What do you make of the Cummings analysis, Maggie?
Well, number one, where on earth does he get the evidence from that Omicron might be worse than people are anticipating? Because even the top virologists and epidemiologists are saying they need more data until at least till next week or week after. So I don't know whether he's quite pro lockdowns, isn't he? But you're right in terms of reform. And in fact, I bought the book that he recommended, or he told all the his staff within the civil service to read last Christmas by, and I've forgotten, big entrepreneur, guy who set up Intel, Andy, whatever. Sorry, that's very bad of me. But basically it was, ruthless, dynamic, get to the root of it. Now, you can't change overnight sort of 100 years of the way the Mandarins have operated. So I'm sure they're absolutely delighted to see the back of him. But as always, there's a germ of truth in what he said. The civil service has perhaps been rather asleep at the wheel for a long time, certainly in terms of pandemic planning, and the army too, actually.
Yeah, he says, I've said many times this year, the most important lesson of COVID is not even about pandemics. It's that even after a disaster as big as COVID, our political parties and permanent bureaucracies will prioritize business as usual over learning, even when many great officials want to learn. So he does compliment some officials. He says, even when that is the case, the system's culture and incentives defeat them. It's that issue. You always have that criticism of Cummings that I think is always valid, which is, although he has a brilliant brain in many respects, he's not that good. I mean, he does have his supporters from the Vote Leave gang, obviously, who are very loyal to him. But beyond that, he finds it difficult to take people with him. And shifting bureaucracies or changing the course of history is very often about persuasion, isn't it? As much as sort of ordering people around and scaring them. But it is nonetheless always a really interesting read, his Substack, and the link is below if you want to become a subscriber to it. Now, Maggie, your choice is next. Really difficult story, lots of different versions of it, and you've chosen the account from The Telegraph.
From The Telegraph, absolutely. And this, of course, is the murder of the little boy Arthur by his biological father and stepmother. And that's the headline they've gone with, which is so evocative, a bruise for every day of lockdown. Now, these cases are so, number one, it's just, you want to cry reading it. It's so horrendous. But once again, what we're hearing is that grandparents, other relatives, friends had warned social services. And indeed, apparently the uncle had even contacted West Midlands police, and they've shown pictures of bruising on the boy's body, and was indeed visited by social workers, and the explanation given of play fighting. Well, of course, after the event, you're going to get a lot of people saying, we warned, it's not for us to maybe judge the context of it. But even so, it's clear that there were a lot of red flags. And you have to ask really what they were doing and whether we need to take another look at the way the social services operated, because police, social services, there are too many of these accidents, aren't there? The other issue, of course, is that lockdown meant he didn't go to school, he wasn't seen by so many people. And in fact, I saw some numbers in a report yesterday that apparently the harm to young children has gone up by 25%. Which is, as a lot of people were predicting last summer. So it's a horrible, horrible story. The other flag is that, of course, his biological mother was in prison for having killed her lover. So that surely must have been to the police and the social workers a red flag, because violence tends to be, if you like, within the same environment. So, there will be many, many, many investigations into this and questions to be asked, but it's tragic.
The evil of it is such that the attempts by the grandparents to get the authorities to do something about it, the stepmother, who has been convicted of murder and sentenced, I think, to a minimum of 29 years, and the father has been convicted of manslaughter, but the efforts were made by the grandparents, and the police were around, and social work, and as is, the banality of evil, the stepmother was clearly so convincing that they concluded that the complaints were malicious. To what extent lockdown is a complicating factor in all of this? I mean, Alistair, we are going to see, aren't we, more and more examples of unintended consequences of lockdown. I'm not saying it's principally to blame in this case, but it is another unintended consequence of a massive social experiment that the authorities were under pressure. He wasn't at school. Absolutely, appalling story. Which I think, though, I mean, I read all the stories this morning, the Telegraph's version, the Times version. I'm sure there'll be more commentary over the weekend, but just found it very difficult to process. I would highlight Joshua Rosenberg on Radio 4 on Friday, obviously very experienced reporter, and he was seeking to explain how this is one of those stories that comes along occasionally, where just he tries to keep professional distance, but just can't, because it is so, in one sense, baffling. I mean, how the hell can human beings do this to each other? But I think we'll move on to your story next, Alistair. You want to focus next on France.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, sort of two stories in one. One on France and one on Anglo-French relations. The first is the interview in the Times today with Eric Zemmour, who is a far-right polemicist turned politician. And it's a great interview. It kind of captures the oddness of this sort of strange quality he has. He's a sort of very small character who, the interviewer remarks, looks a bit like Charles Aznavour, the singer. He's very small, but has this sort of a curious manner about him. He's also incredibly pompous and bombastic. He launched his campaign to be president this week with a video, which is one of the unwittingly hilarious, albeit sort of kind of frightening 10 minutes him as Charles de Gaulle. I mean, exactly like Charles de Gaulle in the 18th June 1940 address to tous les Français. It's exactly the same. He's got the mic. He's positioned looking into the camera in exactly the same way. And then it's sort of 10 minutes of him talking about, France was a great country, and now it's we all remember the France as it was in the mid-century. That France is gone. Your culture is sort of in decline, and it gone into decadence, and the thing that he says twice in the 10 minutes is you are being replaced, which is a reference to this idea of the great replacement, that white European cultures are sort of being replaced by immigrants, populations from outside Europe over time. And and this is a process that is sort of facilitated by a pacifist liberal elite that has sort of lost confidence in itself, or is self-serving, or all the rest. But it's a great interview because it kind of captures he's a bit of a manic quality. On Reaction this week, on our blog, The Hound, we had a story on the video which compared him to Enoch Powell, and the response on Twitter was quite funny, I found, because a lot of people said, oh no, he's nothing like Enoch Powell because Enoch Powell was incredibly intelligent. and I was like, well, on one level, no, he's not exactly like Enoch Powell. He didn't go to Trinity College, Cambridge and read classics. He's not the same. But there are two similarities which really strike me. One, the serpentine eloquence, very similar, very elegant French. He speaks in this incredibly self-consciously elegant way. Powell did it in every interview you watch with that. Powell, is whether it's the time, but he had this extraordinary eloquence, which meant that you could start off with a prima facie logical statement, and by the end of a speech by Powell, you'd end up in this weird position where the stream of logic has sort of moved you into a demented area. That's what Powell was brilliant at. That's
what ultimately what I always regard as fraudulent about Powell, and what made him so inherently dangerous was that he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what he was doing the day that he made that speech, all the accounts in the run-up, to make it clear that he knew how provocative he was being. It wasn't some great, I mean, he may have felt it intensely, but he was provoking and looking to make a political impact out of it. So yeah, he may be academically brilliant, but I think it was fundamentally very dangerous.
The second bit, which is very important, is what people do not quite get about Zemmour is the end of empire angle. And he is an Algerian Jew, and his parents came across because of the civil war and the changed relationship between France and Algeria. Many of the sort of, and he, in a sense, is a figure of that time. The debates he is having are the Jean-Marie Le Pen ORS offsprings of that kind of series of debates about French identity. And he's, in the same way, Powell was definitely, it was all about the Commonwealth, the EEC, and trying to negotiate this new world as he saw it, in which Britain had lost its place.
I think the force of
the funny way, Zemmour is also an offspring of the end of empire, but a different empire and a slightly different set of debates. But
I think Powell is a creature of empire, and he's almost would identify pre the empire starting to disappear as a citizen of, or subject of empire. That's his identity. It is the British Empire. And then that produces in him this, I think it helps explain the force of the backlash that he feels and the retreat. Well, if the empire is being dismantled and disappearing, then the duty and obligation to disappears, and his politics is defined in response to that in the 60s and 70s, and becomes intrinsically kind of narrow-minded. I mean, what fascinates me about this French election at the moment, and there's a danger in seeing this too much through the prism of what's going on with Brexit at the moment, and the French pay a lot less attention to the Brits, I think, than sometimes we pretend. But it's just hilarious to hear Britain constantly, dismissed by French elites and by French media and the president of France as Britain being sort of lost in this populist experiment. I mean, what is the upcoming French election other than a populist election? Look at the candidates. Macron himself is undeniably a populist in the way that he provokes, the tropes that he uses. And look at everyone else who's running is essentially running on one variation or another of a populist platform. Is that unfair, Alistair?
I think, well, it's the the angle that I find I'm thinking about a little bit with Anglo-French relations and Brexit is the common, we are really, our elites are certainly not talking to each other on the same terms, and we're not communicating properly. Yeah. Maybe we talked about this on this review. It's always been a bit like that with France and England, where we've not always had the same interests. There has been a lot of skullduggery, but when the chips are down, we kind of get together. And I think we've got to accept that the chips are down at the moment. We are in a tough situation on all kinds of fronts. And I just think some of the immaturity that really quite, people with great CVs, what theoretically deep knowledge of each other's countries, come out with real caricatures of the other side. I listened to a podcast this week on Radio France. It's the Culture Stream with Sylvie Berman, who is the ex-French ambassador to the UK. And I hope the link will be in the comments. And for anyone who, her book recently came out, which is sort of about, Britain as a unsure of itself. I can't remember what the title is. So, and there's been lots of reviews in the English press. But if you do have, if you do have a bit of French, it's not difficult. Speaks very clearly. It's a really interesting interview because it kind of sums up. This is a person talking about the UK to her, basically to clearly a journalistic friend. So she's very frank about what she thinks about the UK. And the interview is genuinely an astonishing caricature of, one, the British public, two, British politics. Everything is about the shape-shifting of Boris to the exclusion of almost everything else. And all of these kinds of, and there are several things which then happen as a result in the way she thinks about the UK. Everything that was once considered a kind of orthodoxy of British public life is, because of Boris, now a kind of joke. So she says the special relationship, well, that is I think the phrase she uses is total illusion. Well, it's not a total illusion, because, you know, Britain and America cooperate in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
There's a huge security relationship, there's an intelligence sharing relationship, as there is with France, as there is. It's like saying the Entente Cordiale is a total joke. It's not. It's an important international alliance. But I kind of think she doesn't really believe what she's saying. But then you think, well, she kind of is. She's speaking on her own terms. And she's just saying, how can you live in this country for quite a few years and come away with this real caricature? And I think we're the same with France. You know, we're certainly not brilliant at reading the currents of French politics.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that is the case. I'm not sure that we are the same. It is inconceivable that the UK government would send someone with a similar attitude to France to be British ambassador. If you think of how simpatico Ed Llewellyn, who was ambassador, was to France and to French ideas, and how interested, you could argue, maybe the FCO has been too pro-French, or certainly too pro-EU at various points. But I just find it inconceivable that the British elite or British ambassador would produce a similar simplistic account of what French culture, society, and politics is. I mean, am I being too harsh on the French, Maggie?
No, not at all. And I think it sort of comes down to the fact that the French really can't bear that we stopped speaking French in the 14th century, and they basically, lost us. I think that, as we just pointed out, there's huge, I hate the word, don't like the word populist, but there is clearly a lot of unease with the way that immigration from the Maghreb has happened, and they haven't been very clever about it. Put them all in the banlieue, where actually a lot of people are living in very poor circumstances. So I think there's quite a lot of jealousy of the way that we have managed to integrate pretty well. And we don't have riots, well, not since the 60s, perhaps, Brixton, but we haven't. We've actually had, again, quite a good multicultural, and I don't think they can quite. So I think that they're sort of hitting at us, a reverse psychology in a sense, and maybe a little bit jealous about how we've managed to do that. And it's easy, we're easy to knock, aren't we? It's so easy for Macron to call Boris a clown and a knucklehead, but we know that actually behind the scenes, they actually get on rather well. It suits them both. So I think there's a lot of rivalry, and there always has been.
Well, they did get on well, and then
I think they still get on well.
I'm not sure. Not sure. I think that it's a real mystery, that relationship at the moment, and it's going to be difficult to know until the memoirs are written what was really going on, and the extent to which Macron is obviously, he's in campaign. He's in campaign mode, but he began by regarding Boris as a great thinker about geopolitics. Said so. Just said he's underrated. Take the guy seriously. Said that on the record, and then something has gone very badly wrong via Brexit and via the French election. But none of it is very healthy. Should we move on to your next choice, Maggie, which is about midwives?
It is about midwives, and it is because the Royal College of Midwives introduced some guidance for what they called postnatal people. on how to help them with their children, their babies, sleeping. So you can imagine the word mother did not appear in this literature at all. It was just postnatal people. As you can anticipate, everybody went crazy about this, and they've since issued an apology. Now, to my mind, I think the apology is almost worse than the original crime. They called it an oversight. An oversight. How can it be an oversight where you published literature online? It will have gone through many people through various committees, and to avoid the word mother. I mean, it's just so extraordinary. And I think they need to explain how there was an oversight, quite apart from the original nonsense. I think there is one man in Britain who has given birth. So basically, an entire country's literature, NHS, Royal College, changing it because of a few, one or two people, male gender, who might wish to give birth.
So the story was where, Maggie?
It was in the Times. Well, it's been everywhere, but the Times was a good report of it. Sorry, that was in this morning's Times.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to, for my final choice from the Spectator, a really lovely piece by Douglas Murray about Anthony Smith, who was he helped start Channel 4, worked at the BBC for more than a decade, ran, I think, the BFI, the British Film Institute, and was 17 years president of Magdalen College, Oxford. And it's just, and I highlight it, A, because it's a beautiful piece of writing and an ode to friendship, but it's just beautifully done because the headline is "The Type of Person Who Makes the World Work." And it describes a personality that we'll all know people like that, people we've encountered, people who've looked out for us or inspired us down the years. It's a very funny piece. I love his description of Anthony Smith. Gives him the perfect thing to say if you're having dinner with a film director or a theatre director who's produced an absolute stinker and you don't know what to say, how to get around this. So all you say is, "You've done it again," which I think is absolutely brilliant. But I'm just going to read the last paragraph. "No one has ever devoted themselves more successfully than Tony to quietly fundraising for this country's institutions and working for scholarship schemes for students who needed help most. Right to the end, a stream of people would visit him in London for advice, whether it was a former chancellor or a student starting out. The chances were that they were in the area to visit Tony. The obituaries will probably say that he had no children. That isn't true. He had thousands of us." So it's a marvelous piece of writing. I think on that basis, I think we're going to wrap up this episode of Press Review on Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button below. Also visit the site where you can become a member of Reaction. We have a members only event coming up soon, which is rather exciting, just for Christmas. And if you're a member of Reaction, you get Maggie's weekly column, you get Tim Marshall on geopolitics exclusively for members, you get my weekly newsletter on politics, and lots of other stuff from the Reaction team. So until next time, thank you for watching and listening.